Bienvenidos, qué bueno que están por acá y queremos aprender el uno del otro. Ese es el corazón, aprender el uno del otro. Hoy vamos a entrarle al punto principal. Hoy yo invité a Pier, quien es el fundador del movimiento, junto con un hombre llamado Tim Keller, y hace muchos años yo dije, Max, yo voy a necesitar que tú comiences y cuentes la historia, le digo yo a Mac. Necesito que cuentes la historia, cómo comenzó todo. ¿Cómo comenzó este movimiento de trabajar juntos? Porque nosotros en Latinoamérica necesitamos esto. A ver cómo es todo lo que está pasando. Así que, Mac, I just want you, Mac, to feel free to share your heart. That will be my question to you, Mac. Welcome to, thank you for being here with us. Mike is a writer too. There is a book that being the last book I read with Mac is New York Disrupted. La interrupción que Dios hizo en New York. Así que I am so happy that you, Mac, are here with us. Please feel free to share how all this start. That would be so great to hear you. Thank you, Mac.
Buena tarde. Jose's been helping me a little bit here. So it's delightful to be with all of you today. My roots are in the Midwest, but my wife and I lived in New York City for 35 years, and we attended a church that spoke 60 languages. Every one of the countries on this call had members in our church in New York City. My son-in-law is from Brazil, so I have 2 Brazilian granddaughters. So it's a great privilege to be with you this afternoon and to share a little bit of the New York story and how God has birthed something that is helping unite churches and leaders in cities all over the world. Now, what I'd like to do this afternoon is to walk through a bit of the story of what God has done in New York and is now helping other cities around the world. So I'm going to share my screen. The presentation today is for Movement Day Latin America. And I want to begin by describing the New York City story. My wife and I, Maria, moved to New York City in June of 1984. And when we moved to New York, my wife was 3 months pregnant. We had no place to live, but we had a strong sense of call from God to move to New York. And when we moved to New York in 1984, New York had 3 crises that it was facing. The first crisis was financial. New York City was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. A second crisis was a crisis of the murder rate, a violence crisis. In 1984, when we moved to New York, in December of that year, there was a German guy by the name of Bernhard Goetz who shot 5 unarmed African-American men on the subway. And that incident escalated a crisis of murder in our country, in our city, that culminated in 1994 with 8 murders a day. There was so much death in New York that the city morgue simply ran out of room. And we had murder in our own neighborhood. We experienced the violence of the city firsthand. My wife Maria was mugged at a local laundromat. So we experienced what it was like for millions of people to live in a climate of great fear. And then the third crisis was a spiritual crisis. In the 1980s, we believe only 1% of the people who lived in Manhattan were evangelical Christian. So out of a community of 1.5 million, that meant only 15,000 people were attending a Bible-believing church in the 1980s. So the question is, how did the movement grow in New York City? There were a few factors that caused the movement to take root in New York City. Leaders in New York City were feeling a great sense of desperation during the 1980s. In 1987, I was on staff with InterVarsity. We work with college students. And I met two staff from Campus Crusade, a group called Here's Life, that were working with the inner city. And we decided that we would organize an event to bring together 16 congregations to pray together on a Friday night. And that was February 5th, 1988. We invited 16 churches, and 75 churches showed up. And over the last 30 years, we've had more than 2,000 churches involved in praying with the city and with one another and for the city. That was the first step that was taken to help plant a gospel movement across all these different denominations and language groups in the city. The second initial factor was collaborative church planting. Tim Keller, who some of you are familiar with, moved to New York City in 1989 to plant Redeemer Presbyterian Church. Tim actually had, we believe the number is 50,000 people praying every day for the successful planting of Redeemer. Prior to Redeemer Presbyterian being planted in Manhattan, there had not been a single successful church plant by the PCA denomination in a northern city. Redeemer was planted, and then Tim invited me to co-create with him what we call the Church Multiplication Alliance. That began in 2003. We had 10 denominations involved, which include Baptist, Pentecostal, Lutheran, Foursquare, a number of different groups that really committed to help each other. And the reason this is so important is that churches 10 years and younger are 8 times more effective reaching new people than churches 10 years and older. So those were the two beginning steps that we took to birth a movement across New York City. The third step we took is that we built a foundation of knowledge. What we have found in most cities is that the average person in the average church has very little idea what's happening in their own city. We commissioned a research project in 2009 to really study where we were seeing church growth. And we saw that evangelical Christianity grew from 1% to 3%, which is the 300% growth. And it represented 30,000 new people in church. And that represented primarily new churches. Over 40% of all the churches that we surveyed had been started since 2001. And the fourth step was we actually launched what we call a Movement Day expression on September 30th, 2010. And in the next 5 years, we saw that 300% became 500%. And it represented another 30,000 people attending church in Manhattan. So what we see today is that there are 60,000 people worshiping in Manhattan than were worshiping in Manhattan in the late 1980s. And then lastly, we built what we described as a robust backbone organization that would help coordinate the efforts and resources to assist churches. Back in 2008, we called it the New York City Leadership Center. In New York, it is now called Lead NYC. And then our global expression is called movement.org. So those are the steps that we took from starting in the late 1980s all the way up to the present. The next question is why did the movement grow? What are the principles of growth for Movement Day, beginning with just a few cities? In 2015, we had cities, New York, Dallas, Port-au-Prince, and Pretoria. And just a few months ago in September, we had over 900 cities that participated in our MDX gathering. I believe that we need to understand how strategic cities are in God's plan. I believe one of the reasons that the movement in New York has grown so rapidly is in part because of its global influence. There's a report published by A.T. Kearney that lists New York City as the most influential city in the globe currently. It's very much like reading the New Testament. And the New Testament is really the story of the city in Jerusalem and Rome. It was the story of how God used the cities to reach both Jew and Gentile in the first century. The New Testament is really the story of Jesus going to die in Jerusalem as the religious capital of the world, and Paul going to die in Rome as the political capital of the world. And the story is told in regard to how God uses the city to attract people to the gospel. Another reason why movements grow is because leaders really come to know their city. Leaders become subject matter experts on the great opportunities and challenges of their own city. Our vision is to see the smartest Christians with the biggest hearts designing the next decade for their city. And we believe that a movement grows when we build alliances with key stakeholders in every city. Clergy and churches are working together with commerce, leaders from the marketplace, civic leaders from the government, and then community and nonprofit leaders. As these alliances take root, then together they can define and address the greatest challenges facing their cities. Another important step is just simply calendaring a date to get started in your own city with what we would describe as a movement day expression. The purpose is to get the body of Christ together in a representative way in the same room on the same day to design the future together. So those are principles and how we've seen growth in New York and other cities across the globe. When we look at Latin America, Latin America has some of the great cities of the globe. The top 11 cities, beginning with Sao Paulo all the way down through Fortaleza, represent 64 million people across Latin America. And what God is doing in Latin America is one of the great movements of the gospel in 2,000 years. The great cities of Latin America have a very vibrant church that is having great impact across the globe. These are a few of the trends that I've studied across Latin America over the last 15 to 20 years. In Brazil, in the early part of 2000, it's believed that evangelicalism grew from 9% in 1991 to 22% by the year 2006. In fact, when I was doing some research on the biography of Luis Palau, it was said that there were more evangelicals in church in Brazil on a Sunday than Catholics, and Brazil was considered to be the second largest Catholic country in the world. In Guatemala, the estimate is over 40% of the population is evangelical. That is an extraordinary achievement for the church in Guatemala. It was estimated that by 2004, 15% of Latin America was evangelical. And the Latin American Catholic bishops reported that 8,000 persons per day were converting to evangelicalism. So the question is, how do we get started? If a city currently does not have something like this, what are the initial steps? The first step is to build an alliance. Again, this is where clergy, civic, community, commerce leaders are all working together to study the city and to ask the question, what is possible in our city over the next 10 years to see the gospel grow and to see people served, to see people that lack opportunity and resources brought to the kingdom and then empowered to create a future. A second step is to develop a united prayer strategy if one does not yet exist. What I have observed over the years is that the most powerful thing that can happen in a city is if a community of churches agree to create a monthly calendar. where at least one church is praying every day for the welfare of their city. It's patterned after a movement called the Moravian movement of the 18th century. There was a young German leader by the name of Nicholas Count von Zinzendorf who challenged his community with the verses from Isaiah 62, verse 6 and 7, which says to give God no rest and give yourselves no rest until he accomplishes his purposes in all the earth. They took that challenge and began a prayer vigil that went uninterrupted for 100 years. And God used that prayer vigil to raise up 300 missionaries, many of whom came to the United States. And so this is a very important and powerful expression of the unity of the church. We gather pastors every January to pray together for 48 hours. We've been doing that for 30 years. We've had this daily prayer vigil in action for a period of 20 years. And that has really sustained the movement spiritually. A third step is to commission research, is to really ask the question, what are the 5 greatest stubborn facts of your city? When we did this exercise in New York in the early 2000s, we realized that the majority of our pastors were untrained, so we needed to create a leadership opportunity. We realized that much of New York was very unchurched. We realized that a high percentage of our city was living below the poverty line. And that informed a lot of our priorities as we worked on developing the movement in New York City. A next step is convening a day that we call Movement Day, where all the Alliance members can review the research together. Good research will inform your best strategy as you think about the next 10 years of what to do together. And then lastly, we encourage leaders in cities to commit to a 12-month rhythm of meeting with a 10-year goal. We call the 10-year goal a North Star, the big idea. When we started Movement Day back in 2010, the big idea was to see evangelical Christianity in Manhattan grow from 1% to 10% in our lifetime. We're halfway there. We've gone from 1% to 5%, and we've put in place a strategy to get to 10%. Redeemer City to City currently is training 100 church planters every year to help plant the next 1,000 churches in New York City. And we are very committed to promote and support and resource that strategy to help us reach that goal. These are some guiding principles as you think about your city and what God is doing. Every movement is preceded by a crisis which creates disequilibrium. It's always important to answer the question, what is your crisis? Many of us have experienced crisis as a result of COVID. New York was experiencing a murder crisis, an economic crisis. Every city is experiencing some kind of crisis that can be used to rally leaders to come together and pray together and work together. Second principle is that the most powerful weapon in a movement are vision and agreement. Vision will inspire leaders to rearrange their priorities, and agreement will keep you committed to each other for the long term. Another principle is to recognize the value of younger leaders. Historically, the average age for movement leaders is under the age of 28. Zinzendorf, when he started the Moravian movement, he was 27. Martin Luther King Jr. in the US Civil Rights Movement was 26 when he began to lead the civil rights movement. Martin Luther was in his early 30s when he began to lead the Reformation. The next principle is that the foundation of a movement is united prayer in creating a leadership pipeline. We have found that those two pieces are so important to creating a strong foundation that will endure over many decades. And then lastly, the visible parts of a movement will always include a big idea, an alliance of churches, and a world-class partner. When we got started in New York, the big idea was to plant churches in Manhattan. The alliance of churches were denominational leaders that we work with that were committed to working together. And when we began, the world-class partner was Redeemer, city to city. We've done a lot of work with partners like a World Vision, a Global Leadership Summit, other organizations that are the best in the world at what they do. And they can really help a movement move forward in all their efforts. And then lastly, it's important to remember that God is prepared to do exceedingly more than we can ask or imagine. When we started it in 2010, we were just thinking about New York. That was the limit of our vision. And we look back 10 years later and realize that God is preparing this effort to impact 900 cities and beyond around the world. So whatever God is going to do in your city, he wants to use it to stimulate and inspire and motivate leaders in other cities from around the world. Jose, back to you.
Muchísimas gracias, Mac. Esto es excelente, excelente lo que estás compartiendo. Si tiene alguna pregunta, lo pueden colocar acá. Yo tengo una pregunta, Mac. Mac, I'm going to ask these questions in English for you, Mac.
Sure.
You know, when you share all of that, I've been talking with different leaders from Latin America, and we found that, you know, like we're talking earlier today, you know, Guatemala, the gospel is over, 40%, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's over 75% poverty.
Yeah.
You can see that Argentina, we talk about that, is about 20%, 20-something% is evangelical, around 50% is poverty. Puerto Rico is about 43% poverty, and a lot of over 40% of believers. Venezuela is about 15-20% evangelical, but it's over 85% poverty over there. So in light of that, what do you think will be key for the Latin leaders to make this a reality, to work together? So that would be my question.
Yeah, that's really good data to have, because it helps you understand the gravity of the situation. And we use the language of flourishing. We want people to flourish, not just spiritually, but also socially. And as we look at economically challenged communities in our cities all over the world, it's the same thing in Africa. There are many parts of the world that are living on $1 a day, $2 a day in their global economy. I think a major responsibility of the church is to figure out how to stimulate entrepreneurism within the city context. Because we say the first thing that people need after Jesus is a job. And so it's very important that we gather the very best intelligence on what is working in different parts of the world that can be contextualized to these various cities. Obviously, there's no easy answer. There's no shortcut. But I do think that creating global partnerships with parts of the world that have more resources, and creating ways to foster entrepreneurism, to incubate new industries, that is critically important. It's not an easy answer, but I think that's a very important thing to study to create a pathway out of poverty. Yeah, it's a great question. How can the leader make unity? The critical, the pathway to unity, I have found, is it always starts with humility, and the way that humility expresses itself is when a leader is willing to go to another leader's turf and to take the initiative to build the relationship based on an interest in the other person. So humility is really critical. If we can become students of our city and really put the effort into understanding our city, understanding leaders in the church and in the commerce region. And the second important element is trust building. That a movement will pick up speed at the pace of trust. And the only way to really build trust with a leader is to spend time with other leaders. That's why when we go away and pray for 48 hours every year, leaders actually get more time together when they can go away and pray together than they do the rest of the year combined. So the way that we say the way we spell love is T-I-M-E. And we have to have a strategy to foster opportunities for leaders to spend time together. That's why doing trips together is very significant. I've taken 175 leaders to East Africa, and we've spent 2 weeks together, and those leaders have become lifelong friends. And we have to figure out ways to create opportunities for leaders to spend significant time together. And that's really, I believe, how you foster unity in a city.
That's great. That's great. Muy bien, muy bien.
Thank you.
Si alguien tiene otra pregunta, puede hacérnoslas y me dice para colocarlo, nos hace ver Arturo o a mí para hacerlo. Yo tengo más preguntas, así que yo puedo seguir haciendo más preguntas. Mientras alguien me llega con otra pregunta, la pregunta que viene a mi mente es, en los Estados Unidos es muy diferente. The United States is very different than Latin America in this sense. We have a lot of people that preach us the gospel. Billy Graham,
Yeah.
Luis Palau, Alberto Motesi, Gigi Avila. A lot of people preach us the gospel and all over. And to repent for our sins and, come back to Jesus. And this is great message. We gotta keep preaching that is the essential of the gospel. The point is, there was a time in the 80s or 90s, I don't remember exactly when this began, but the idea that he began saying that Jesus is coming soon, do not go to a study, Jesus is coming soon. I don't know if so we have that preaching. So we have this, we a lot of believers, but a lot of revival, but no transformation in cities. So, how this is one of the things that how to deal with that. That's the thing that, so.
Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the great challenges, particularly in parts of the globe that struggle with poverty, is the temptation to participate in what we would call prosperity gospel, because people are suffering so much from poverty. There is an attraction to believing that God wants to come and kind of fix it very quickly with an economic solution. So I really affirm the need to provide as much theological training as we can for leaders to have a great depth of knowledge of the Bible. I think we really have to look at the model of Jesus and how Jesus came. And when we think about passages like Isaiah 53 and Philippians 2, that the model of leadership that we really stand behind is a sacrificial, self-giving, a willingness to die for the community kind of leadership that will impact other people. We really want to become fluent with the issue of justice in our cities and understand what are the barriers to a just society, just economically, just in terms of opportunity. Because the greatest poverty is not poverty of resources, it's a poverty of opportunity. And what we want to think through in every context is how do we create more opportunity for the future? One of the organizations that I've really grown to appreciate over the last 40 years has been the work of World Vision. My wife and I sponsor about 25 children around the world. And one of the things that we see in their model is that they take 15 years to invest in a community to allow the community to become self-sustaining. And that's the kind of leadership and modeling that we need in communities in parts of Latin America that have really suffered as a result of long-term economic disadvantagement. And that's why in the movement day vision, we really want the smartest people with the biggest hearts in the room to think through complex issues because they're not simple, they're not going to be solved overnight. But to really mobilize a critical mass of leaders who want to make a long-term difference.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I have another questions about the youth. You mentioned the youth. You know all these leaders were 20 something when they're making impact in their city and their nations. Any advice for us as Latino leaders? Sometimes we like the pulpit. We like to be in front. We like to be, so help us here. Anything that we can learn from you in that sense?
Yeah, well, it's, the U.S. is not doing very well in this regard, so we have a lot to learn on our end as well. But what we're learning, is the importance of really paying attention to young people that are motivated spiritually at the high school and the university level. What I think is true is that a majority of people make a faith commitment by the time they're in their teenage years. And a couple things that we're learning in the U.S. context, which may apply, is the importance of training in the home. That young people they're more likely to be strong spiritually if there's a formal kind of training in the home. And one of the surveys that became interesting in the U.S. was conversation with different denominational groups, young people. And the survey found the only group of people that could really articulate the faith of their parents were Mormon young people. And it was a real indictment on many denominations who have not sufficiently invested in the training and other young people. What we have found, at least in the US setting, is that the greatest determinant whether a young person has a strong Christian faith for their whole life versus those who don't are those that participate in some kind of a missions trip. That when there's a missions trip, that it really challenges a young person, that their faith becomes a part of them. I would really encourage if there are a relationship with, there's a university movement called the IFES, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. It's an intervarsity in the US. And they have some of the best leaders among young people around the world. And that's a great point of contact, I would think, in Latin America.
That's good. I have a couple questions. First, Diego. Second, Pedro Sifontes. Diego from Chile, and then Pedro Sifontes from Panama. Diego, adelante.
Sí, un gusto saludarle. Bueno, quería saber cuáles son las condiciones
What are the conditions
que ustedes han visto en los países donde han ido a trabajar, que generan las condiciones que generan más desunión?
What are the conditions that generate more division? Let's call it like that.
¿Y qué han hecho para superarlo?
And what you have done to overcome that?
Yeah. So I think there are typically two primary causes for division. One is if people only relate to their particular cultural group. And then secondly, if people only relate to those that have their particular denominational background. So the way that we have attempted to deal with that is a couple things. Again, we try to build relationship between very diverse groups by putting them in the same room together. It's very important. I find some of the best teaching on this is in the book of Ephesians, and as well as the Gospel of John, chapter 17, where we talk about the fact that when people become followers of Jesus, they become part of God's new society. And that when people have a common faith, regardless of their ethnic background, that people with a common faith have more in common with people who are different culturally but similar belief system than they do with people of their own cultural background but who are not believers. That we have to see each other as family and to take that posture in our relationships. I think it's really important to study the passages of the Bible that highlight the fact that the gospel transcends culture. The book of Acts is so important in that regard. And when you look at the transformation of Paul in Acts, he basically went from being a Jewish racist to being someone who spent the rest of his life uniting the church, raising money from the Gentile Christians to help support the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. That's a snapshot of transformation. So we have to, and again, part of the value is if we can celebrate and appreciate other denominational traditions that are separate or different from our own. Like even though I'm ordained Baptist, I celebrate the tremendous impact Pentecostal church in New York and other places around the globe. The same thing with the different denominations, Presbyterian or Lutheran or Episcopalian. As long as the group has a vibrant engagement with Jesus, then we have that in common.
What is the specific characteristics that you can see in a movement day? What needs to be happening in that day, movement day? That's his questions.
Yeah, so an effective movement day answers three questions. First question is what I call the research question, or what is our current reality? The second question is the vision question. What do we want to see God do in the next 10 years? And then the third question is the practical question. What do we need to do together for the next 12 months to make progress?
Excelente. Excelente. Wow, excelente lo que estamos aprendiendo de Mac. Mac, estamos muy agradecidos. No veo más preguntas. Ya se nos llegó el tiempo también. ¿Qué les parece si oramos un momento? Me gustaría animarlos, los que llegaron más tardecito. Por favor, escríbanos su nombre, su correo. Nos gustaría mantener la comunicación. Esto lo vamos a hacer una vez al mes. Gracias a Mac que estuvo compartiendo con nosotros. Gloria al Señor por eso. Amén. Pueden abrir su micrófono. Estamos despedidos. Saluda al que no quiere conocer a alguien acá. No sé si está. Abren su micrófono. Bueno verte, Benjamín.